right, welcome back. Yesterday, in case you missed it, we covered the buyer consultation, how that rolls, kind of getting started with your buyers from, generating the lead to sitting down with them, what that flow should look like for the first half of the transaction. Today, we're going to visit the actual buyer broker representation agreement. It's actually called the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. And we're also gonna say a little prayer and cross our fingers and toes so that we have enough time to also go over the ABCD form, which is required with that BRBC form. So we're going to cover both of those. You should be able to see my screen. If you have questions as we move through this, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask, or put the little hand up, on your screen. I should be able to see it. Or I do have the comments chat box open as well, so I'm watching that. Or you can just unmute yourself and interrupt me. Is usually the easiest way to make me stop and ask your question. I don't count it as rude, so feel free to stop me anytime to get questions or clarification or anything that you need. In order to get in, yes.
I do.
Yes.
So are you going to show us, it's always me, I know. Are you going to show us how to save everything in there so we don't have to repeatedly put it in there?
I may not have time to get into templates today, but I'll make a note of it if I don't have time today to show you how to do it in the future.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, absolutely. All right. In case you've never logged in to your zip forms before, you go to car.org. You should be able to see that on the screen. I click Access Realtor Secure Transactions. You can also access it up here at the Transaction Center. You've got the same thing, but I click on the little bubble that says Realtor Secure Transactions. At that point, it's going to take you to this next page where you're looking for this Lone Wolf transaction zip form additions. That's what we're looking for. And just so you guys know, if you have any questions with technology or tech issues regarding this, that's who you want to contact, is this Lone Wolf, not Car. They're not going to help you with any of those tech type questions regarding your zip forms. So we're going to click Access Now on that transaction zip form addition. If you're not logged into Car, it's going to prompt you to log into Car. And it's going to sign you in. Well, maybe. Let's try again. It's going to think about it. It's going to validate your membership. Once it's validated, then you're going to click the little yellow button to continue to transactions. That's going to open up a new window. If you have your pop-up blocker on, you may have problems accessing this new window. So you may need to turn your pop-up blocker off for anything car forms related. We're just going to wait for it to open. For your buyer transactions, you are going to create a new folder if you've got a new buyer that you're creating this BRBC for. So the way that you want to create that new file, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. Hold on. Just got to get it to close all the windows and stop giving us a spinning wheel of death. Oh, no, I clicked on another button. Hold on. Come back. All right, no, I don't want to get paid on my commissions. All right, there we go. Except I probably clicked an extra time out of impatience, and now it's going to open up another file. Patience is hard for me. All right. When you open up your zip forms, it may take you to the transaction tab, or it may take you to your dashboard tab. So your tabs are across the top of the page. You got dashboard, forms, transactions, templates, doc and box that I've never actually clicked on, tasks, contacts, partners, and more. There we go. Oh, no, don't do it. All right, there we go. Phew. All right. I didn't click on anything, so stop giving me a spinning wheel. If you're on dashboard, I recommend that you set it up to your default. You can go into your settings so that it lands you on transactions, so that every time you log into Zip Forms, it brings you to your transaction files. And I don't know what is up with my forms today, but we have spinning wheel of death.
Is that the grid form or the grid view that you're looking at?
This is the grid view. So I was going to show you how to toggle between the two. This is just about the only thing I like to see in grid view. So you can change the way that your transactions lay out, where you have little boxes or you have little lines. So in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that little box with the lines on it. If you click that, it'll change your transactions instead of the boxes like mine. It'll list them out in list format. I have no idea what's going on right now. We're going to try this again. When at first you don't succeed, try again. As you see, because I'm already logged in the second time, it's not asking me to log in, but it still validates your membership before you can log into Zip Forms. Hopefully this connection will be much better than the last one, or at least faster. And I'll remove my hand from the computer so I don't accidentally click on anything. See, Jennifer, I'm only just barely techie, barely.
I'm glad to know it's not just me.
You too can have success in real estate, because I'm just, fake it till you make it. All right, here we go. So again, if you toggle over here on the little lines on the right-hand side of the page, it'll give you a list view. So it looks like this rather than the cubes. And again, most of my stuff I prefer in list view, but for some reason, the transactions, I like them in little blocks. Maybe it makes me feel like they're organized. To start a new buyer transaction, you're just going to come up here to the top where it says new, and you're going to click on that little plus box, which is going to open up this new transaction. For a new buyer, we're going to draw up that BRBC. We're going to put in new purchase or offer. Now, keep in mind that I only create one file per buyer. So every offer that we write, I don't create a new file for that buyer. I just keep it all in the same file. So here's where you would enter the transaction information. So if it was a buyer and their last name was Petard, I would put Petard purchase. And I'm going to put the date on this one because I have like 10 Petard purchase files in my transactions, because every time I open up like a test transaction, this is what I do. So I don't even know what the date is today. We'll just call it 4/4. That's close enough. May actually be the date. Okay. You can plug in a property address, but if you're just drawing up that BRBC, you probably don't yet have a property address, so you can leave that blank. And then we're going to click residential property here under the categories. It's required. It's got the little red star next to it. If you had templates set up, you could assign templates here based on your template selection. We're going to just see if I can get it to not pick up a template. I don't know if that'll work. I don't think it'll work. And then once you have that, you're going to hit save. So you don't have to mess with the templates if you don't have it set up. Now it's going to go ahead and apply that template. That's what Anastasia was talking about earlier, is you can apply templates to the transaction. So as soon as I open up a purchase transaction, it would automatically add to that transaction all the forms that I might need for that purchase. It opens it up here in the summary. Again, I'm not going to fill in any information there. I am going to go to the parties tab. So now we're on the gray tab line, and I just clicked on parties. Here's where you would want to add in your buyers' names and their emails. So if you just had one buyer, we could plug in their name there. I'm just going to use mine and test@gmail.com because I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube. So there we go. So your plugin, I just use their first name, last name, their legal name. This is how they're going to appear on the purchase. So we want their legal name and then their email. I'm not worried about all the other stuff. That stuff's all in my CRM or my contact relationship manager. Here in Zip Forms, I just want the information needed in order to draw up the contracts and have them sign things, which is their legal name and their email. Once I have that in there, I'm going to hit save. If you click the little box before save and hit save to address book, it'll save them to your contacts list inside of Zip Forms. So the next time when they decide they're ready to sell this house they're buying, you can just pull it up from your contacts and it'll auto-populate their information into there. You can search through the contacts. So as you see here, you can add multiple buyers to this transaction. So if you had more than one buyer, add them all in there. And again, with their email addresses. Does anybody have questions about how to add parties to your transaction? Everybody's good. Fabulous. All right. Then the next thing, we're going to scoot over from parties on the gray line to documents, which is the next one. This is where I spend most of my time inside of Zip Forms, is here under this documents tab. I don't use the checklist or notes or history for the most part. I'm going to spend most of my time either in documents or the e-sign, which is how you send out things for e-signatures. Now, because I had a template assigned to this one, it went ahead and put in some transaction items, and there's some forms. I've got the statewide buyer and seller advisory, the market conditions advisory, the residential purchase agreement, the wildfire disaster advisory, and the additional agent acknowledgement, because I work with another agent on all of my transactions. Yours may not have anything in there. That's totally fine. We're not even focused on those things today. So we're going to come up here where it says all forms in the upper right-hand side, the little blue button. I'm going to click on that all forms and it's going to pull up the forms library. Here you can search for that form and you can search for it either under name, like I could look under buyer rep, right? So buyer representation, broker compensation becomes the top one, or I could search it for the BRBC. If you know what the acronym is, it would also come up. Once I click on this and it adds it to my transaction, it's going to highlight it blue so that I know it's in there. And while I'm in these forms, I'm going to go ahead and add that ABCD form, which is the, oops, I can't type. I can spell, but I can't type. The anticipated broker compensation disclosure. Okay, that's the form that's going to go hand in hand with our buyer representation and broker compensation form. Does everybody see how to add forms to your transaction? Yes? Anybody need help? All right. We're going to double click on that buyer, broker representation and buyer representation and broker compensation form. You're going to have the option between the Forms Editor Classic and the new form editor. I really like the new form editor, although it's got a couple glitches in it that they're working on. If you open up the Forms Editor Classic, you can edit one form at a time. You open it up, you mess with that form, you close it down, you go back into the next form. With the new form editor, you can edit multiple forms at the same time. So that's the one I usually select. All right, and that brings us to it should automatically add that form in there. So it automatically adds the buyer representation and broker compensation form. If I wanted to add that ABCD form, I can just come down here. It shows all the forms that are in my transaction. I come down to the bottom. It's got those 6 little dots on the left-hand side of the name next to the box. If I click on those little dots, and I can drag it up into my transaction so that now I can edit both the buyer representation agreement and the anticipated broker compensation form at the same time. I don't have to close out to get to the next one. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the agency disclosure. As far as going through it in detail, just know that this is the agency disclosure. If I'm walking this does need to get signed when you sign the buyer representation and broker compensation. It also gets signed with any purchase agreement and with any listing agreement. This just identifies the way in which a buyer could be represented or a client could be represented in a transaction. You can be represented with a seller's agent. You could be represented with a buyer's agent. A seller's agent just represents the seller of the property. A buyer's agent just represents the buyer of a property, or it could be an agent representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Now, keep in mind too that, and how I would explain this to a potential buyer, right? Because we're sitting in front of the buyer going through our buyer presentation, and we're asking them to sign the broker compensation or the buyer representation broker compensation form. I would explain this as these are the ways that you can get represented, right? Seller's agent represents just the seller. Buyer's agent represents just the buyer. Or if me and anyone else in my office is representing you and the seller, it's going to be counted as an agent representing both the buyer and the seller because it's with the brokerage, not the individual agent. But keep in mind that if I'm representing you and there's another agent in our office representing the seller, that we do have that fiduciary responsibility to you individually, and I'll make sure to protect your rights and keep all of your information confidential. Does that make sense? And they're gonna be like, oh yeah, absolutely. That's a good time also, just so you know, if I am representing the buyer, I'm sitting down with the buyer, it's also a good time that I introduce that, hey, if you decide that you want to write an offer on a property that I'm the listing agent for, I'm probably going to ask another agent to represent you in that purchase, just so there is that degree of separation so that I can watch out for the best interest of the seller and that somebody's also watching out for the best interest of you as the buyer. Okay, so I always outline that as part of the agency disclosure. Okay. This is where they would sign. You check the little box, names, Realty One Group Fox goes there. This license number is not appropriate because I have not yet opened it or updated it. I think it's this one. I could be wrong. See if it changes. Nope. All right, well, it doesn't like me. There we go. Your salesperson name goes there and that goes there. The second page is just all the legal jargon, and that's how I would explain it to a buyer. Page 2 is just all the legal jargon. It outlines the civil code section that talks about the ways that you could be represented in a transaction. Okay. The next one is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. This just states that as a real estate agent, I'm not allowed to discriminate based on any of the protected classes. Okay. And if at any time you feel like you were discriminated against, there's examples of, or there's all the fair housing resources that you can go to file a complaint. Okay, that's all I need to cover on this form. They can read it in detail, but it's just, as a real estate agent, we can't discriminate based on any of the protected classes. Okay, here's all of those classes: race, color, ancestry, national origin, religion, familial status, source of income, any arbitrary characteristic, criminal history, military or veteran status, marital status, gender, gender identity, gender expression, primary language, genetic information, disability, either mental or physical, immigration status, sex, sexual orientation, age, citizenship, and medical condition. Okay, any questions about either the agency disclosure form or the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory?
No, ma'am.
Okay, fabulous. The next one is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. Again, all of these forms have to get signed with the buyer representation agreement. I apologize. It took a 3-page form and turned it into a 20-page form, but they're all necessary. This form, as I explain it to my buyers, would just be that at any given time, I may be representing more than one buyer at the same time. Please note that I would never discourage you from writing an offer on a property or discourage one of my other buyers from writing an offer on a property, even if you're writing them on the same property. And I am required to keep your offer confidential from any other buyers that I may be working with. So I can't share with another buyer that you wrote an offer at X price or that they wrote an offer at X price. So I must keep those all confidential. Okay, and then that's all I'm going to go over because I don't really care about the seller side of things. I'm not representing them as a seller. I'm representing them as a buyer. Okay, it may be advantageous as well to mention here offers not necessarily confidential, to let the buyer know that although I'm going to keep your offer confidential from other potential buyers or from the sellers that I may be working with, if we submit an offer on a property, that seller may not keep your offer confidential, and they may share any of the terms or price or anything with other potential buyers on that property. Okay, any questions about that BRBS, the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller? Okay, the next one is the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. I always let my buyers know that please don't transfer any funds without first verifying with the person you're supposed to be sending the funds to that the instructions are accurate and correct. Okay, most of the time when you open escrow on a property, that title company is going to send the wire instructions directly to your buyer. and they should confirm it as well with that title company before sending the funds. Okay. Really easy way to summarize that form. 1 page, in, out, done. And then we finally, 7-page into this, we get into the BRBC. Okay. Sorry, state of California. You know, every little lawsuit that gets filed, they create a form for that. So there you go. There's your first 7 pages. So we get into the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. The representation period and right to represent, and then the buyer's name is going to go here, right? Because we already plugged that into our contacts, it auto-populates it. It also auto-populates the broker information because that was already entered into this transaction on a previous form. You need to have a beginning date and an ending date for this to be valid. Okay, beginning date, if I double click, it just puts in today's date, and ending is X number of days later at 11:59 p.m. or upon completion of resulting transaction, whichever occurs first. That's the representation period. The non-exclusive right, unless paragraph B 4B2 is checked, to representing buyer and acquiring real property or a manufactured home. So here is right, and this is totally subjective. If it's up to you how many days you want to put in here. Do you want to put 120 days, which would be effectively 4 months, right? 30 days in a month, 120 be 4 months, right? So if you're like thinking, man, I would like it to be good for a year, then we just put in 360 days later, or 365 days later, right? So you can decide what you want to put there for the expiration period. There's no wrong or right answer to that. Kind of depends on how ready, willing, and able your buyer is. Okay. No pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. The buyer acknowledges that the buyer has not entered into a representation agreement with another broker and has no obligation to pay compensation to any other broker arising out of the acquisition of property identified in paragraph 3, except, and here's where you would identify other brokers or properties. So if they had a previous buyer broker agreement, that's where you would put in that information here on line 2. Okay, most of the time you already know this about your buyer. You've already had this conversation. You know where they're coming from. You know if they've been shopping for properties. You know if they had signed a document with another agent. So most of the time we don't have to have this conversation with our buyers when we're sitting down actually filling this or completing this form for signatures. Okay, any questions about 1 or 2? All right, moving on to 3, the property to be acquired. Make sure you fill this in. Keep in mind that it's either A or B or C, not A, B, and C. So you could identify specific properties on an attached list, which would be C. You could identify B, which would be a following specific properties only. So if you just have 1 or 2 properties that you're mentioning, you'd fill it out there. Or if we're being more broad, we would fill it out here under A. So where is this buyer looking for properties, or what areas do you service, right? I'd probably go more so with like, hey, what areas do I service? So it might be, hey, anything within the counties of Solano, Napa, Placer, El Dorado, right? Sacramento, Yolo, right? So you could put it all in there by counties. You could put here like the greater Solano and Yolo County areas, right? So you can decide where you want to put. You can put specific cities, and you can also fill in the price range. I'd probably put here like anywhere from 0 to, I'd put $1 to $1 million. If I knew they were kind of in that mid-price range, if they were shopping in that $1 million price range, I might go like 500, like 0 to 2 million, right? So you want to fill that in there. The more specific you are, the better this form's going to hold up if it was to ever be challenged. Here you can put an other line. So, right, we can fill in or blank city, right? Who knows? Any questions about section 3, the property to be acquired? So if you service specific areas or counties, you could pre-populate this form through templates to always populate those counties onto your BRBC, and always auto-populate a price range and an expiration date. So it could be fairly magical. You'd have very little fill out on this form. Okay, so that's section 3. You're either going to fill out A or B or C, not all of them. Compensation to broker. This is the important part, section 4. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between the buyer and broker. The real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. Oh, on that note, sorry, let's back up to number 3. Don't put like all of California on here, like location, all of Northern California, because you realistically probably don't service all of Northern California. If I want to go buy a property up in Calaveras County, you probably can't help me, right? So be specific with the areas that you actually service. And then that way, if somebody's like, oh, well, what if I want to buy a property in Calaveras County? You can be like, oh, that gives me the opportunity, right, to refer them to another agent in that area. So, and service them well and not have to come back in and modify my representation agreement on that term. So make sure you're specific to areas that you actually service. All right, compensation. Buyer agrees to pay broker as follows. Applies unless 2 or 3 is checked. Do not check both. So, right, so it's A1 or 2 or 3. So A1 is blank % of the acquisition price and blank. So here's where you put in like, hey, the average commission that's offered to a buyer's agent is 2.5%. And I'm totally good with that. And you could do like that. And well, I'm going to pay a transaction fee of $7.95. So I'm going to plug in that as well. So they're going to pay 2.5% plus $7.95. We're not going to call that an admin fee or anything like that, because you'll get in trouble for that. You can just call it what it is, right? So there you go. If they ask what that covers, you're going to have to, explain that to your buyer. You could just leave it at 2.5%. You could be like, hey, the average is 2.5%, but I want 3%. So you could put in 3% there. Totally up to you and how you want to run your business. But for the most part, the average commission offered to buyer's agents is 2.5% if you didn't want to charge your buyer any additional commission. That's 1. If we didn't want 1, you could do a flat rate, which is 2. So if we check the box for 2, we would fill in just a flat rate there. So you could be like, hey, I'm going to do this for $5,000. I'm a flat rate realtor. Okay. Or if you have a commission schedule attached, you might check number 3. So if you had somebody like maybe in that lower price range, they're shopping for mobile homes and you're like, they're looking at $100,000 mobile homes and I want to make more than $3,000 to $2,500. You could do a compensation schedule so that you get paid X% up to this purchase price and X% over that purchase price up to the next one, right? So you can make it like a tiered compensation schedule depending on the purchase price. Totally up to you. It's your business. Run it how you want. Broker right to compensation is B. Broker shall be entitled to compensation specified in paragraph 4A from buyer if during the representation period or any extension thereof, the buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property described in paragraph 3. The seller therefore completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by default, excuse me, of the buyer as follows. Excuse me. Okay. I might die. Broker involvement. We're just going to skip through number 1. Don't leave it to broker involvement, non-exclusive representation. Always check the box down here for number 2, that it's exclusive representation. That means that any property the buyer buys, you're going to get compensated for it during the term of this agreement. Okay. Buyer acquisition, exclusive representation. This agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring the property in the expectation of being paid for broker services. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. Okay.
Go get your water. Go get your water.
I'll be okay. I'll survive. I'm going to be okay. Maybe. If not, I'll go get some water here in a second.
Amy, did you see there was a question in the chat?
I didn't. I missed that. When completing the contract, does it give you... No, Derek, it does not give you a warning or a red flag that it is incomplete. The car forms library doesn't care how complete or incomplete your forms are, which is why if you haven't filled this out very often, it's a good idea to have somebody else review it. If you're in the mentor program, then always have your mentor review your contracts and your BRBCs before you have them signed. But if you're not in that program, the first few times you fill out a form, have somebody look it over for you. Most agents in our office are going to be more than happy and willing to review a document so that they can make sure it fills out completely. All right. There we go. Buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to the buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 3. So Jennifer, on our conversation yesterday, that section 3 there, that B3 helps cover that situation where, you know, maybe you had a buyer looking for properties and then their relative or significant other or somebody else comes in to actually make the purchase on behalf of that buyer. That covers you right there, that number 3. Just so you guys know.
So
Okay.
just real quick. So legally, if that other person signs this document, it can still hold the person they were looking for liable to this document and this agreement.
It could.
Wow. Okay, cool.
So so let's say I had a buyer and then they signed my agreement and then another agent went and they happened to sell them their house. So how do we get compensated? Like, we just go through legal, or how does that work? And I guess they'd be paying they would get their commission and then somehow they would have to pay us their commission, like what we're owed according to what we have on here, or how does that work?
Yeah, so you would then take it up to legal. If the transaction's already closed, you would take it to legal and you would go after the buyer for the percentage specified in this agreement based on the purchase price of the property. The other agent's still going to keep their compensation. It doesn't necessarily negate them from getting compensation, but the buyer's responsible to also pay you.
Got it. So then at that point, it comes out of their pocket. Gotcha.
It comes out of their pocket. If you get wind that your buyer you're worked with is in contract on a property and you want to hold them to it, they haven't yet closed on it, you can submit this to the title company and it would get added to the buyer's closing statement as a cost to the buyer. Okay. So that B section, marking that box for 2 is super important. Otherwise, it's only if you can prove that you participated in helping them acquire that property. But the number 2, the exclusive representation, is kind of like an exclusive listing agreement. It covers you in case they buy any property anywhere. Okay, this also covers new homes, right? If your buyer gets in contract on a new home after you told them that, hey, anytime you go look at homes, including new homes, you need to schedule it with me so that I can attend that appointment with you. And then they go schedule and get themselves in contract. And then the new home builder's like, I'm not paying you a commission. You could technically hold your buyer liable for their portion of the commission. Okay. Now, whether you decide to do business that way is totally up to you. It depends on the buyer. It depends on the situation, but it does allow you the ability to do that. Section C is cancellation of representation agreement. Either the buyer or the broker may cancel this agreement by giving notice to the other. Okay, by giving written notice to the other. The agreement shall be terminated if paragraph 4B1 applies upon receipt of the notice or blank days after receipt, but we know that 4B1 is not going to apply. It's going to be 4B2. So it's going to be this agreement shall be terminated if paragraph 4B2 applies 30 days after receipt of the notice. Okay, so if we've checked that box for 4 or for B2, right, then and somebody wants to cancel this, it's 30 days after they give us the cancellation is when that cancellation goes into effect. So a buyer can cancel this without your permission. It just delays them 30 days from being able to go look for properties without having to pay you. Okay, broker shall nonetheless be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or any time specified in paragraph 4E, which we haven't gotten to yet, the buyer acquires property for which there was broker involvement. That's CAR form MBIP paragraph 4.1, provided broker delivers to buyer a written list of those properties for which there was broker involvement. The written list of broker involvement properties shall be delivered to buyer within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. Before, during, and after the 5-day period, buyer is advised to notify any other broker of broker's rights under this paragraph. Okay, so that gives your buyer the ability to cancel. You have to provide them with the forms that show the properties that you showed them or you helped them interest in order for them after the expiration period of them to get commission for those properties. So this prevents somebody from going and seeing a property, serving you a termination, waiting 30 days, turning back around, and then going and submitting an offer on that property. That's what this is kind of set up to prevent. And if checked, only paragraph 4B applies, 4B2. Neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to expiration except by mutual agreement. So if this was me and I was filling this out for my buyer, I would check this B2, and then I would also check C2, which means that cancellation happens by mutual agreement. The buyer has to communicate with me that they want to cancel. We have a chance to talk about it, and then we both agree to cancel. We would do that with a modification of terms.
Are you going to put a date in that C1?
No, I don't.
Sorry.
I don't have to worry about C1 because it's only if paragraph 4B1 applies. If 4B2 applies and we check this box, then they can't cancel except by mutual agreement. End of story. We don't have to worry about putting in any numbers in C1. Okay. Accounting for payments to broker by others. If anyone other than the buyer compensates a broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards buyer's obligation to pay commission. That just says that, hey, if we're getting compensation from a seller, that helps to cover the buyer's obligation. So if we have 2.5% here and the seller's paying us 2.5%, then the buyer doesn't have to come out of pocket for any money in order to pay our compensation. We're getting it all from the seller. So that's D1. D2 is if third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to broker. That's the default. Or you could check the next box, which is credited to the buyer or other, right? So they always give us our other lines. So I usually leave this the default that it gets paid to broker. So if the compensation being offered by the seller is 3% and I have 2.5% here, I get all 3% of the compensation. Okay. If we check this box, then an additional 0.5% would go to the buyer. And if we check this box, we would need to fill something in here on this line, something like any excess to be split equally between broker and buyer, right? So something like that could be put in there on the other line. Any questions about sections A, B, C, or D so far?
What do you put there, Amy?
For this D2?
Yeah, what do you normally put?
I just leave it as the default. Any excess should be paid to the broker.
Okay, so you don't check any of the boxes?
I do not.
Okay.
Yeah. Section D3 is authorization to include commission and offer. Buyer authorizes broker to include term in buyer's offer, obligating seller to pay broker directly through escrow for any compensation that buyer owes broker. That's that new little section on the RPA where it states that that you can negotiate, you get permission from your buyer here to be able to utilize that portion in the RPA where you can negotiate, like if the seller's only offering 1% commission, you could negotiate as part of the offer that the seller is going to pay a total of 2.5% commission. So that's that little section on the RPA. This is what gives you the ability to be able to utilize that section. Okay, so I don't check this box either. This does not authorize. Additional broker right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to the compensation provided for in paragraph 4A, right? That's 4A up here. That percentage. If within blank calendar days after expiration of the representation period or any extension thereof, or if there is a cancellation after the effective date of the cancellation in paragraph 4C, buyer enters into agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement provided prior to expiration of this agreement or any extension thereof, or if there is a cancellation within the time specified in paragraph 4C, broker delivers to buyer a written notice of those properties to which there was broker involvement, CAR form MBIP. So I would absolutely fill something in here. This is what protects you that, hey, we cancel this agreement. The buyer comes to me, they want to cancel any properties for which there was our involvement on, I'm still going to get paid on. So I'm probably going to put something here like 120 or 90 calendar days after expiration or cancellation. Okay. Again, these numbers, it's your business. You're welcome to put whatever you want there. You could put 30 days, 60 days, 27 days. It really doesn't matter what you decide, just kind of put some thought into it. This is their period that they couldn't cancel the agreement, turn back around and write an offer on a property that you showed. However, keep in mind that you do need to provide Form MBIP, which is the Notice of Broker Involved Properties, right? Properties that you actually showed them, not properties that got sent out on an automated email. We'll go over that here in a second, but it's properties that you actually had involvement on, properties that you actually called the other listing agent on their behalf to ask questions, to glean information from, properties that you were involved in, more than just sending an email out. Okay, you want to make sure you keep track of those properties that you do on the buyer's behalf. Okay, the way that I would explain this first page to my buyers as I'm sitting down with them is this just outlines the representation period that I'm going to represent you from today until the end of the year, until the end of the transaction, whichever happens first. Once you buy a property, you're released from this fiduciary agency agreement. And they're gonna be like, okay, cool, sounds good, right? I usually don't put 360 days, just for the record. I usually put somewhere around like 6 to 9 months. I feel like 360 days is a scary number for a buyer to look at. And it may also make them think that, oh my gosh, it's going to take me a year to find a property. It's hopeless, right? We don't want them to feel hopeless. But again, what you put there is your choice. As part of this, we're going to look for properties. I can show you properties anywhere inside of Solano, Napa, Placer, El Dorado, Sacramento, and Yolo counties, right? Any properties in any of those areas, I'm happy to show you, and I can help you do that purchase, as well as maybe you put to include new home communities, off-market properties, and for sale by owner, right? Why don't we put that on our contract so that they know that, hey, we can represent you in any of these. So there's never any question as to what we can represent them in the purchase of. Right? That way they're not like, oh my gosh, well, my friend decided she wanted to sell her property, so I'm just going to buy it from her. And I can't, I assume I can't use you, so I'm not even going to tell you about it. I'm just going to ghost you. Right? Or show up at those new home communities without me being there. This solidifies that relationship. Okay. So I'm going to help you purchase any properties, like anywhere in your price range in these counties. I can help you with new home communities. We can help locate off-market properties. We can also help you with for sale by owner properties. Right? So I've outlined, hey, this is what I'm going to do for you on your behalf. Okay. Property acquired in, for that, right? I'm going to be due a commission of 2.5% of that purchase price. It says acquisition price there. I'd say purchase price. And I'd say, just so you know, the typical market in our area, or what's customary in this area, is that we get paid by the seller. So we put you in contract on a property. Generally speaking, the seller pays our commission. The average commission that the seller pays in this area is 2.5%. So in most cases, the seller is going to pay for my commission for you, which means basically you get represented at no cost. So it's a win-win for you. And if this is ever more than what the seller is offering, or the seller isn't offering a commission, we'll have that discussion up front before we even submit the offer on the property. Is that fair? And they're going to be like, yeah, okay, cool. Right? Ta-da, done. This outlines that I'm going to represent you. It's exclusive representation, which means I'm going to represent you at any purchase of a property that you make anytime during this representation period, right? Anytime during this agency agreement. And you'd be like, cool. Okay, that makes sense. Cancellation.
What
down
if
here.
sorry. What if they decide, okay, well, I want to buy a commercial property, a quadplex or something. Is that a different form, or does this one still apply?
Yeah, so this is going to be for, I think it outlines it's going to be for a residential property, but let's look at real quick. If a buyer during representation enters into agreement to purchase, acquire property. So we're just saying any property up here. That being said, you need to make sure you check in with the brokerage on what you can and cannot represent a buyer doing, but it would cover any properties, because it does not list residential property up here.
Copy. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. I
Just
feel
out
like
of-
somewhere it did. Hold on. Oh no, real property or manufactured home. So no. Did somebody else have a question, Jennifer?
I just wanted to ask you really quick, why did you cap price range 3A? You put $1 to 1 million. Is there any way to leave that open-ended?
I would
Like-
probably never leave it open-ended. Again, the more specific you are, the more likely it is that this is going to hold up in a court case. And so you kind of want to know what your buyer's range is. That's part of the reason that we send them for a pre-approval ahead of time. And let's say they were pre-approved to 700,000. I'm never going to cap this at 700,000. I'm always going to bring it over that. So if you had somebody working in that like $800,000 to $900,000 range, I may take this to like 1.5 million.
Okay, yeah, I was just, because I mean, some of our Napa people, our Napa clients, you know, they're looking at $2, $3, and $4 million homes. And so that's why I just wanted to know if we could leave that open-ended, but you're just saying, whatever you put there, make sure it's about 500,000 above what you think they're going to qualify for.
Yeah, what you think they qualify, or what they qualify for, yeah.
Okay.
Or the cash available in their bank account, if they're a
Right.
cash buyer.
Okay.
Nothing better than those $2 million buyers that are cash. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, one of these days, I hope to experience that.
One of these days you will. This bottom section here, the cancellation, just lets them know that, hey, if at any time we decide this relationship isn't working out, we can cancel this with mutual agreement. Right? So we let them know that there is a cancellation right in there. Notice how I'm not going through this in detail with my buyer. I'm just summarizing each section so they understand what the box is checked and what that section means to them. Here's on D is where I would outline, remember when we talked about that commission that would be due and that oftentimes that's paid by the seller. Here's where that's outlined, that if anyone other than the buyer compensates me for services covered by this agreement, it's going to be credited towards your obligation. And again, if the seller's portion ever doesn't meet that obligation, we would have that conversation before we even write the offer on the property so that we would know how to proceed forward. Okay. In E, I would just outline that if any time this is canceled, any properties for which we have seen or I've shown you, we've visited those properties, I would be due the commission if you decided to cancel this agreement and then turn around and write an offer on one of those properties. Right? So we're just going to summarize that additional broker compensation. Sometimes I skip over that one altogether, but I would probably outline it. And it's probably a good idea to do so. Okay, so that's how I would explain the first page to my buyers. Just kind of summarize each section and what that means to them in like layman terms. Disclosure of anticipated payments to broker's brother. Broker prior to writing an offer on a property will disclose to the buyer the amount of compensation broker expects to receive from the third party on that property by providing buyer with either a copy of the MLS listing showing the cooperating compensation offered to broker or a separate document such as an anticipated broker compensation disclosure. That's that ABCD form. So you can do it either way. We can either give them a copy of the MLS printout, like that one-page printout, because it now shows the commission offered to the buyer's agent on that one-page printout, or we can use the ABCD form. You can use either. Okay, but you want to do that. If we don't check this box, it's at time prior to writing the offer on the property. If we check this box right here, then it's prior to showing a property. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Oftentimes, if we're sending those MLS reports over, they're getting copies of that, but I would probably not check this box and I would just leave it prior to writing an offer. Okay. Broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than the buyer. Buyer is responsible for payment of compensation if the third party does not pay as anticipated. Okay, that's section F. G is timing of compensation. Compensation is payable upon completion of any resulting transaction, and if escrow is used through escrow, broker should be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from an agreement for property specified in paragraph 3 closes during or after the expiration period of the representation. The expiration of the representation period, just meaning that, hey, if we put you in contract and this expires while we're in contract on that property, I'm still due the commission because we put it in the contract before the expiration. You don't have to go back and do a modification of terms and extend the expiration of this. Now, if they canceled on that property, you'd want to make sure you sign a new one or do an extension of time. You do that with a modification of terms. Okay. If acquisition, so this is still timing of compensation. If acquisition is prevented by default of the buyer upon buyer's default. right? So if we're in contract on a property and the buyer defaults, not they cancel under their obligations, but they default on that property, you could still be due commission. And if acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when the buyer collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise, compensation shall equal 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in paragraph 4A, after first deducting any unreimbursed payments, credits, and expenses of collection and suit, if any. Right? So if the seller prevents the buyer from closing on the property and the buyer sues the seller, and they get an award for that, then you would be due some of your commission from that award. Okay. Any questions about F or G? Disclosure or timing? All right. H is payment through escrow. Buyer hereby irrevocably assigns the broker the compensation provided for in this agreement from buyer's funds in escrow. Buyer agrees to submit to escrow any funds needed to compensate broker under this agreement. Broker may submit this agreement as instructions to compensate broker to any escrow regarding property involving buyer and seller or other transferor. Right? So this is your proof that you're due commission. So if the seller's not paying the commission, you would submit this to the title company so that they would have instructions of what the buyer owes you as part of commission. This could also be submitted to the lender as well as proof that the buyer has additional closing costs. It does need to get disclosed. If the buyer is paying you commission from their funds and they are financing the deal, the lender needs to know about it. Otherwise, it's going to screw up that closing disclosure and delay the close of escrow. Okay. Pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. If buyer acquires a property during the time buyer is obligated to compensate another broker identified in paragraph 2, broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent buyer in such transaction, right? So if they have 2 signed agreements, right, and let's say they have one that they canceled, but it's still good for another 30 days, and we're going to put a property in contract that they were part of the broker involved on that property, then we don't have to represent them and we aren't due commission. Okay, so it's important to know if your buyer has signed something previously.
Amy, didn't the I don't remember where it was, but somewhere on our previous pages, it said that the buyer, by signing this paperwork, says that they are not represented by they are not in another buyer broker agreement. Isn't
yes,
that clear?
Right here on 2 says no pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreement. So they should disclose to you then. Again, you should have that conversation. Before we get to this point, there should have been a conversation if they were seeing properties with another agent, if they signed something with that agent. And if they did, ask for a copy of it.
Yeah, but there was, B1, broker involvement, no, that's not it.
Section 2. It's just section 2 at the top, the pre-existing buyer
Oh,
representation.
yeah, buyer representation and compensation. So they've already like agreed that they're not on that section, right?
Yes, they have. And if they fail to disclose that, just know that down here, it still would be a
So
pre-existing.
it's a redundancy, but it covers it twice.
Yep.
Basically. Okay.
Yep.
That's all right. Just want to make sure they were both saying the same thing.
Absolutely. Section 5 is agency relationships. So buyer acknowledges receipt of the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships, CAR Form AD, prior to entering into that agreement. That's why it's important to include all the forms, those first 7 pages, with a copy of this agreement, and they sign them all. B, I'm not good with letters today, as possible. Dual agency with the seller. Broker will represent the buyer in any resulting transaction. Broker may act as agent for both buyer and seller. Broker in writing shall confirm the agency relationship with only buyer or both buyer and seller prior to or concurrent with buyer's execution of a contract to acquire property. Buyer acknowledges receipt of a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent, BRBS, right? So we have to disclose if you're representing, if the brokerage itself, right? If Realty One Group Fox is representing both the buyer and the seller, you need to disclose that to your buyers at time that you're getting ready to draw up that offer. Okay, it has to be disclosed. Broker authorizations and obligations, right? This is the important part because this authorizes and tells them what our obligations are. The buyer authorizes broker and the broker agrees to use reasonable skill and diligence and provide guidance to help buyer with the acquisition of property. The broker will assist buyer in locating and presenting selected properties to buyer, presenting offers authorized by buyer, and assisting buyer in negotiation for acceptance of such offers, and as applicable, terms and conditions following such acceptance, and facilitating the escrow process for such accepted offers. As directed by or agreed with buyer, ordering reports and investigations, and scheduling and attending meetings and appointments with professionals chosen by buyer, and upon request, providing buyer with a list of professionals or vendors who perform the services described in an attached buyer's investigation advisory. Provided broker has a referral list for such requested services, and upon request, assisting buyer with the financing process by making referrals to lenders known to broker, and assisting buyer in obtaining a loan pre-qualification to the extent broker can do so without acting as a mortgage loan broker. See form, CAR form BTA for more information, right? So I'm probably not going to read this paragraph to my buyers, but I probably am going to learn how to summarize it really clearly that, hey, here's my obligations to you. I'm going to help you locate and present and show you properties. I'm going to help present offers on your behalf. I'm going to help you in writing those offers, giving you suggestions and ideas in order what should be included in that offer. I'm going to present those offers on your behalf, right? I'm going to negotiate on your behalf throughout the entire transaction, whether it's timeframes, whether it's a repair request, right? I can help you with scheduling those inspections, attending inspections, helping point you in the right direction for vendors that can complete inspections or contractors, including and not limited to, right, like mortgage loan officers. So I can refer you to people that can complete the loan for you in a timely manner. And it might be a good reason to explain why it's important to use a local lender at that point, right? If they're not already using one that you have recommended, right? So we want to learn how to summarize this paragraph. This is one that I would probably write out a summary for in your own words, and then I would practice it. Okay. If the property contains residential property with 1 to 4 dwelling units, I will conduct a reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the property, excluding common areas, to disclose all buyer facts materially affecting the value or desirability of such property that are revealed during this inspection, right? So in addition to the things listed above, I'm going to complete a visual inspection of the property to make sure that I don't notice anything that might affect your desire to purchase the property. Broker shall deliver or communicate to buyer any disclosures, materials, or information received by, in the personal possession of, or personally known to the individual signing for broker during the representation period, unless otherwise specified in writing. Any information provided through broker in the course of representing buyer has not been and will not be verified by broker. Broker services are performed in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws, right? So any information we get about this property, we're gonna pass on to you. There is nothing that will be confidential about a property that you're in contract on. So if the seller tells me something, the neighbor tells me something, the listing agent tells me something, I am required to make sure that you have all of that information. Okay, broker obligations. Any questions about that section?
Hey, Amy, I do on that one. So is that traditional with anything? If a neighbor tells you something, you have to share with the buyers? Because is it not hearsay? Or
it is hearsay. And yes, absolutely disclose. There's been lawsuits that have been won on buyers' behalves because the crazy neighbor came over and said something, and it didn't get passed on to the buyer, and then it actually proved to be true. So you may want to couple it with, hey, just so you know, I didn't verify this, but this is what the neighbor said.
Okay.
Yep.
Good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Pass along any information that comes across your plate. Because again, right here, it says that we don't verify the information, right? So we don't have to verify if the neighbor's crazy or sane or normal, or if it actually happened, right? But we just pass that information along, and you can always couple it with the fact that I didn't verify this, but this is what the neighbor said.
Yeah, because I've run into some neighbors that want to give you all the gossip on the whole neighborhood. And I'm like, you're always wondering, like, do you pass that down? I mean, some just want, I don't know if they're bored or they just don't want the house to be sold.
Right. And then you think, well, does my buyer really want to live next to this crazy person? I don't know. So I should probably pass along what the neighbor.
True, true.
And you do want to do it in writing as well, so it's provable. So you want to shoot them over an email or a text message that says, hey, I'm just passing this along. Here's what the neighbor told me today while I was at the property.
Okay.
Right. And that way you've got it like in a written format that you've sent it to them. And you may even
Okay.
have them sign off and initial it as well.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Any other questions? All right, buyer obligations. The buyer has obligations as well to act in good faith. They agree to timely view and consider properties selected by the broker and to negotiate in good faith to acquire the property. Buyer further agrees to act in good faith towards the completion of any contract entered into for property in furtherance of this agreement. Personal and financial information within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement. Buyer shall provide relevant personal and financial information, including but not limited to proof of funds and pre-approval or pre-qualification letter to broker to assure buyer's ability to acquire property. If buyer fails to provide such information or buyer does not qualify financially to acquire property, then the broker may cancel this agreement in writing, right? So the default is 5 days. You may be like, hey, in the next day, I need a copy of your proof of funds and your pre-approval letter, or you may leave it at 5 or change it to 3. It's totally up to you. But this is, they are signing that they are going to provide you with this information. So if they're already pre-approved, you're having problems getting that pre-approval letter from them or proof of funds, this gives them you the ability to hold them to that, or you can cancel the agreement. Reasonable care and other professional assistance. The buyer is obligated and agrees to read all documents provided to buyer. Buyer agrees to seek desired assistance from the appropriate professionals selected by buyer, such as those referenced in the attached buyer's investigation advisory. And the buyer is advised to read the attached buyer investigation advisory and buyer transactional advisory for a list of items and other concerns that may warrant investigation by buyer or other professionals, right? Read your forms, buyers. That's a good one to make sure you highlight as you're going through this document. Reports and investigation. Buyer agrees to pay for reports, investigations, and meetings arranged by broker on buyer's behalf. Buyer material issues. Buyer shall notify broker in writing, par form BMI, of any material issues to buyer, such as, but not limited to, buyer requests for information on or concerns regarding any particular subject of interest or importance to buyer. Just so you know, I probably have never used the BMI form. I don't know any agent that's actually used the BMI form, but there is a form for the buyer to report their concerns regarding material issues on, to ask questions. Most of the time it just happens via like text or email. They say, hey, can you ask the seller about this, or what about this? So you can decide how far you want to dive into that BMI form, but it is there. It does exist. You could provide the buyer a copy of it at the beginning of the transaction, be like, hey, anytime you've got a concern, just send me this form. Right? And then they send you that form, you send it directly over to the seller to get the answers. Okay. Incorrect, incomplete, or inaccurate information. The buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless for all claims, disputes, litigation, judgments, attorney fees, and costs arising from incorrect information supplied by buyer or from any material issues that buyer fails to disclose in writing to broker. Okay. Any questions about that buyer obligation section? I know the second page is really meaty. It's got a lot of information in it. Alrighty, attorney fees. If any action, proceeding, or arbitration between buyer and broker arising out of this agreement, buyer and broker are each responsible for paying their own attorney fees and costs, except as otherwise specified in paragraph 9A. And then we have dispute resolution, mediation. Buyer and broker agree to mediate any dispute or claim arising between them under this agreement before resorting to an arbitration or court action. Mediation fees, if any, shall be divided equally among the parties involved. If for any dispute or claim to which this paragraph applies, any party commences an action without first attempting to resolve the matter through mediation, or before commencement of an action refuses to mediate after a request has been made, then if that party is the losing party in any such action, the prevailing party shall be entitled to recover attorney fees from the non-mediating party, notwithstanding the terms in paragraph 8. exclusion from the mediation agreement are specified in paragraph 9B. Okay, so attorney fees and then mediation. Mediation terms, the following matters are excluded from mediation: a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure or action proceeding to enforce a deed of trust, mortgage, or installment land sale contract as defined in Civil Code 2985, an unlawful detainer action, the filing or enforcement of a mechanic's lien, and any matter that is within the jurisdiction of a probate, small claims, or bankruptcy court. The filing of a court action to enable the recording of a notice of pending action or order for attachment, receivership, injunction, or other provisional remedies shall not constitute a waiver of the mediation provisions, providing the filing party, concurrent with or immediately after such filing, makes a request to the court for a stay of litigation pending any mediation proceedings. There you go. Those are the ones that are excluded from mediation or not excluded from mediation. Arbitration advisory: if buyer and broker desire to resolve disputes arising between them through arbitration rather than the court, they can document their agreement by attaching and signing an arbitration agreement, CAR Form ARB. That's not automatically attached. So just so you know, generally speaking, you're held to mediation as part of the BRBC, but not to arbitration. Okay. This second page, how I would summarize it to my buyers is, as previously mentioned, if this section F, if at any time we go to write an offer on a property, I'll disclose to you up front what the compensation will be received from the seller so that we know if it's less than or the same as what we talked about above. I'm due the commission anytime the transaction closes, right? I'm not going to go into detail on the fact of the default type stuff. I'm just going to say upon closing of the transaction, and it'll get paid through escrow. So all commission goes through escrow. It does not get paid outside of escrow. This just confirms that you don't have any pre-existing representation or compensation agreements with any other agents, correct? And then you'd be like, yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Agency relationships, as mentioned before on that agency disclosure, you can be represented as either a buyer's agent, I can represent a seller's agent, or we can represent both the buyer and the seller if it comes to the point that the listing is listed by anyone else in our brokerage. I'll make sure to let you know that before we write the offer on the property. Okay, this section here, section 6, we already talked about. I would write this out and summarize it in layman terms, so that you can go through and kind of itemize those items that you're going to do on behalf of your buyer, so that they understand the value that you're bringing to the transaction. Okay. And then number 7, buyer obligations. I would just say your obligations on this are that we're going to look at and consider properties that we find that match your criteria, that you're going to provide me a copy of your pre-approval letter and proof of funds in the next 5 days, over the next week, if I haven't received it already, right? And that just kind of know that you need to use reasonable care and professional assistance. So you're going to make sure that any documents that I send over to you, whether it's for electronic signatures or not, that you're going to read through those documents. And if you have any questions, that you're going to feel free to ask me those questions. And they'll be like, okay, that makes sense. Perfect. Also know that in the buyer investigation advisory that we're going to go over here in a minute, it lists some of the types of inspections that you can have on a property. And I recommend that you kind of read through and familiarize yourself with that, as well as what we call the statewide buyer and seller advisory that I'm going to give you a copy of as well. Right? So read through that, kind of understand what's going to happen in the transaction, that you're going to pay for any reports or investigations. Right? And that you're going to make me aware of any concerns that you might have regarding the property. Right? So those are the buyer obligations. If any time there's a dispute that arises out of this, just know that we're going to go to mediation for that. It's kind of like we're going to sit with a counselor, a third neutral party that's going to sit down with us and see if we can work it out before we have to progress to some sort of a lawsuit or something like that. Does that make sense? And then be like, oh yeah, absolutely. That totally makes sense. Right? I'm going to skip through these mediation terms. Nobody cares. Okay. Advisories, addendum, and disclosures. The following advisories, addendas, and disclosures are attached: the buyer transactional advisory, the buyer investigation advisory, and the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller are all attached. If you're going to include the statewide buyer and seller advisory, go ahead and check that box there and include it. If you include it here with your BRBC, then you don't have to include it with your offer. It's less to sign with the offer. I always include it at either one point or the other. And this would be the best place to include it so that they have a copy of it and they can read through it ahead of time. Okay, here's where you put any other advisories, addendums, or disclosures that are included. Maybe you're going to include the wildfire disaster advisory, letting them know that the property that they might buy is in a wildfire disaster. Maybe the market conditions advisory, you want to include that. You could check that box and fill it in here. Other terms, number 11, that's your other terms in case you need to fill out anything else that needs to be added to this document. And 12 is the entire agreement. All understanding between parties are incorporated into this agreement. Its terms are intended by parties as the final, complete, and exclusive expression of their agreement with respect to its subject matter and may not be contradicted by evidence of any prior agreement or contemporaneous oral agreement. This agreement may not be extended, amended, or modified, or altered, or changed, except in writing and signed by both the buyer and the broker. In the event that the provision of this agreement is held to be ineffective or invalid, the remaining provisions will nevertheless be given full force and effect. This agreement and any supplement, addendum, or modification, including a photocopy, fast mail, which would be a fax, or electronic, may be executed in counterparts, meaning I could sign one copy and the buyer could sign one copy, and as long as they match, it counts as us both signing the agreement. Buyer acknowledges that the buyer has read, understands, and received a copy of this agreement. Received a copy and agrees to the terms of this agreement. If it's an entity buyer, it's a trust, it's a LLC, whatever that is doing the purchase, then we would check the box here for entity buyers. That would be, we used to have to include a RCSD, a representative signature capacity disclosure. We no longer have to do that if we check this box. And this would be if it was a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, estate, partnership, holding a power of attorney or other entity, right? An agreement. So if you've got military people and one is got a POA, that would be a power of attorney. We would check this box because power of attorney falls underneath this box. It's a representative capacity. Okay, this agreement is being signed by a legally authorized signer in a representative capacity and not for him or herself as an individual. The legally authorized signer represents that the entity for which the person is acting already exists and is in good standing to do business in California and shall deliver to broker within 3 days of signing evidence of the authority to act in that capacity, right? So that'd be a copy of like the corporation agreement, a copy of the trust, a copy of the power of attorney, whatever that form might be. The name of the legally authorized signer is, right? So if the buyer was the LLC, Good Day LLC, then you would put the president's name here, right? So you would put Amy Petard, president, right? Or whoever that might be, whoever's the legally authorized signer. If it was a power of attorney, you would put the power of attorney's name there, right? And just so you know, yeah.
Amy, how come that's not blue?
Because I did not check the box.
Oh, once you check the box, it'll go blue. Oh, bam. Ooh. You're so good.
They don't want you filling out things that you shouldn't be filling out. They're not going to tell you what you missed, but they don't want you filling out things unnecessarily.
Because that was one of my questions. I have one that wants to make an offer and he wants to do it under his LLC. So I need to check that and then put his name there.
Yeah, so the buyer would be listed on the contract as the LLC, and then you would fill in his name here and he would sign on behalf of that LLC. Now, if it was a trust, right? If a trust, identify the buyer trustee of the trust, or by simplified name, John Doe co-trustee, Jane Doe co-trustee, or the Doe revocable family trust. So you can list it as any of those. You don't have to necessarily list the buyers as the trust. You could list the buyers as the trustees. Okay, if the entity or a trust is under probate, the following is the full name of the trust or probate case, including the case number. That would be line 5 if it's a probate or court case. Okay, and then we sign there. And it says broker signatures, but notice it also allows you to put the agent information there. So you get to sign on behalf of the broker. You don't have to send it to the actual broker for signatures. If you were doing more than one or more than 2 buyers, notice there's only 2 lines for buyers here. If you have more than 2 buyers, you would include the ASA form, the additional signature addendum form, ASA. And that would be for buyers 3, 4, and 5. Have a really fun transaction. I wish you luck. with 5 buyers. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. Anyways, that would go there. And if you were doing the purchase with 2 different brokers, you would check this box here and include form the ABA. The way that I describe the 3rd page is just this entire agreement is just stating that you've gone through and reviewed the entire agreement and that you understand it and that you are in agreement with entering into a agency relationship with me and Realty One Group. And they're gonna be like, we're good to go. We sign. Okay, everybody signs. The transactional advisory, I know we're over on time. I apologize. I'm just going to keep plugging forward. If you have to go, I fully understand, but otherwise we're going to make it through these. We have 2 more forms on this one, and then I'll also address the ABCD form because it's a really simple form. The buyer transactional advisory, I really like this form. Buying real property. It's kind of like the disclosure information advisory for sellers, but it's for the buyer, so I like it. The buying real property is a process that has many different aspects to it. The information below will help you evaluate your role and the roles of others in the buying process, right? Here it talks about the buyer obligations, right? We already talked about that. Communicate important issues in case they didn't understand it in the contract. Buyers need to notify their agent in writing of any important material issues to them, CAR Form BMI. If buyers' circumstances or interests change during the property buying process, buyers should notify their agent in writing. The reasonable care, since I read that one, I'll read this one. Buyers have an affirmative duty to take the steps to protect themselves, including discovery of the legal, practical, and technical implications of discovered or disclosed facts and investigation of information and facts which are known to them and are within their diligent attention and observation. Buyers are obligated to read all documents provided to them. Buyers should seek desired assistance from appropriate professionals selected by them, such as those referenced in the attached Buyer's Investigation Advisory, CAR Form BIA. Buyers are advised to read the attached Buyer's Investigation Advisory for a list of items and other concerns that may warrant investigation by them or other professionals, right? Buyer obligations, agent duties and limitations. Agents may perform services for buyers during the course of the home buying process. The sophistication of the buyers, the experience of others involved in a transaction, and the requirements of the specified transaction will all impact the agent's duties. Agents' authorizations, obligations, and limitations. For properties to which the agent is aware and not precluded from participating in by buyers during the representation period, agents are authorized to provide and review forms to create a property contract for the acquisition of a specific property, deliver and communicate to buyers any disclosures, materials, or information received by, in the personal possession of, or personally known to the individually agent signing below. And if the property contains at least 1, but no more than 4 residential units, perform a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the 1 to 4 units and disclose to buyers any material facts concerning the value or desirability of the property that was observed during the inspection. Unless otherwise specified in writing, any information provided through agent in the course of representing buyers has not been and will not be verified by agent. Agent services are performed in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. Agent owns no duty to inspect for common environmental hazards, earthquake weakness, or geological and seismic hazards. Scope of agent's duties: the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the agent does not decide what price buyers should pay for or a seller will accept, does not guarantee the condition of the property, does not guarantee the performance and adequacy or completeness of inspection, services, products, or repairs provided or made by seller or others, does not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of common areas off the site of the property, shall not be responsible for identifying defects of the property in common areas or off-site unless such defects are visually observable by an inspection of the reasonable accessible areas of the properties or are known to agents, shall not be responsible for inspecting public records or permits concerning the title or use of property, shall not be responsible for identifying the location of the boundary lines, easements, or other encroachments on title, shall not be responsible for verifying square footage representation of others or information contained in investigation reports, multiple listing service, advertisements, flyers, or other promotional materials, shall not be responsible for providing legal or tax advice regarding any aspect of the transaction entered into by buyers or seller, and shall not be responsible for providing any other advice or information that exceeds the knowledge, education, and experience required to perform a real estate license activity. Buyers are advised to and agree to seek legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from the appropriate professionals. Phew. So glad they put that in there. It's still a mouthful, and it's really good that they read this document. Buyer representation agreement allows dual agency. This representation agreement permits broker to act as a dual agent for both buyer and seller in a transaction. Under California law, even though one individual is a real estate agent, may be the only licensee in direct contact with the buyer on a property transaction, and another individual agent may be the only licensee in direct contact with the seller for that same transaction. Since both agents work for the same firm, the brokerage firm and its agents are all dual agents in that transaction. It also is legally permissible for one real estate agent to be in direct contact with both the buyer and the seller, in which case the dual agency would also be established for both the brokerage firm and the agent in the transaction. If the buyer does not want to allow dual agency, then the buyer should discuss with broker the implications of such request and then come to an agreement with the broker. By signing below, the buyer acknowledges they've read, understand, and received a copy of this buyer transactional advisory. See, it's a good form. Thank you for introducing this form, our forms library. I appreciate it. And then we have the buyer. Now, it'd be nice if they like combine these all into one form, but whatever. The buyer investigation advisory just lists the different types of inspections and investigations a buyer can have done on a property. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different types of investigations they can have. They should read through this and know this. And for a more lengthy version of this, we have the SBSA, the Statewide Buyer and Seller Advisory. I include that one as well, generally with my buyer transactions, either at time of offer or at time of the BRBC. Any questions about the buyer transactional advisory or the buyer inspection advisory? Everybody's good? Fabulous. These are also included as just part of the buyer representation and compensation agreement. So you open up this form, all these forms are included. It's like 13, well, no, it's not. It's, oh, and then we have there's one more, the California Consumer Privacy Act disclosure and notice, just stating there's things that are outside of our control that can't be kept private. Such as sales price of a property and potentially photos. Like we can't control once they purchase a property, whether those photos disappear off the internet or are still available of the interior of the property. That's how I summarize this form through my buyers. It's public record. That's the end of that one. And it's like, I don't even know how many pages. That's 13 of 13. So there's 13 pages that are part of the BRBC, and the BRBC itself is only 3 of those pages. Okay, all those other things are required, so don't try to eliminate them or be like, oh, you don't have to sign this one today. No, you do. You have to sign them all 13 pages. The second form that I'll go over is that anticipated broker compensation disclosure. This one should be provided if you're not providing a copy and having them initial. So if you're providing a copy of the MLS report, like we talked about, remember in the BRBC up here on page 2, it talks about the fact at the top of the page that you're going to disclose to them what you're receiving from another party, and you're either going to do it before you make an offer on a property or before showing the property. If you're doing it at time of offer and you're providing that MLS report, please include it as part of your offer and have them sign off or initial a copy of that report so that you can have proof that you provided them a copy of what the compensation was that you were receiving through that. Or utilize the ABCD form, which is this one right here, which I would just start using as part of the general practice, because you're required not only to disclose at the time of offer, but also at the time of sale what the final commission received was. So you're going to put the information up here. You put in the buyer's brokerage firm here. This is where the buyer acknowledges that the buyer read, understand, and received a copy of this ABCD form. By initialing the box below, buyer acknowledges being advised of the broker's anticipated compensation for the property identified. So the buyer signs here. Then you fill out the property address here, the date that either you first showed it or the date the offer is being made, you put the compensation offered in the MLS. And then you put either it was in the MLS or a cooperating broker compensation agreement, right? So if you're not part of that MLS or it's not listed in the MLS, we probably want a CBC form, or maybe it was a FSBO or something. So you never know what you want to put there, but it's got an other line. So for the most part, it's going to be MLS. You're going to send this out for signatures with your offer. They're going to sign here in this box, and they're going to initial next to any of the property addresses listed here. You're not going to fill out the bottom section until you get ready to close the transaction. When you get ready to close the transaction, you're going to send this back out for signatures, and this is going to finalize what you're getting paid from the seller's broker. Okay, and then you're going to fill out your brokerage firm again here, your information, and that way they can see it. And then the buyer initials the bottom of this page. And the initial is just buyer initials below are not required, but can be used as evidence that the buyer has been notified of the final compensation.
Now,
And this is
Amy, will
one-
Melina be doing some of this and have us get it signed, or is when she does the basic disclosures, or if it doesn't come up through, will she, because I haven't heard Melina bring it up. Is this something we just tell Melina we want included with every buyer now?
This is something that I would absolutely include with every buyer now, as just for my own personal practice. I don't know that the brokerage is requiring it yet. If you have
Okay.
filled out the BRBC, it is required to provide the buyer with that information of the compensation at the time of offer and then before the close of escrow. And so you absolutely need this or the signed MLS report in order to be in compliance, and so that the buyer couldn't go after you for, like, if you tried to charge them commission or something.
Okay.
So I would include this as part of my practice, just
Okay.
a CYA type thing, even if you weren't using the BRBC.
Okay, and you just have them sign it with the offer if you put it through DocuSign?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Anastasia, did you also have a question?
Yes, it's one property per form, correct?
So if you're doing it at time of offer, you would do one property per form, right? So anytime you have that, well, I mean, you could have them, you could come back and reinitial. You could use the same form again and put in another property address, use the one they already initialed, but I would probably just issue a new one when you wrote another offer. Like if their offer didn't get accepted, you went to write another offer. I would have them I would just fill out a new one, clear the old information out, put the new information in. If you were doing it at time of showing, then you would put multiple, but you would put any of the properties that you were showing at that one time in there. So it can be used either at time of offer or at time of showing.
Thank you, ma'am.
And if you use the BRBC, that includes this and 12 other pages?
It does
that-
not include this form. So
Okay, so this form is a solo form.
This is page 14, yes.
Okay, so if we do that whole form, do they all show up, including this one, or no?
No, you have to add it
Okay.
separately.
Okay, I just wanted to find, so really we have this one, so this would make number 14 on that list.
Yeah, for the most part, your BRBC is probably being signed before this form's being signed, because your BRBC should be signed before you go show properties. So
Okay,
you would sign that, and then this one would be included with the offer for the most
offer,
part.
okay. Oh,
Yep.
so much.
So much. So much. There's just so many
Yes.
forms. We won't talk
We
about
all
how
need to be
many there are in
attorneys.
Idaho.
This
Okay.
form that you're talking about, which one is this one?
This form here
This
is the
page?
ABCD form, the anticipated broker compensation disclosure form.
This is within that, the 13 pages of all that stuff, or no? I
No,
stepped out when I
it's
missed when you
separate.
started talking about this one. Separate.
Yeah, no,
got it.
this one's separate. So you would send that BRBC in all its glory of 13 pages out to be signed. You'd probably include that SBSA, the statewide buyer and seller advisories. You're going to add like another 12 pages to it. So you've got like 25 pages to be signed at the time of the BRBC. And then when you go to write an offer, you would include this ABCD form.
Got it.
Got it?
Did
Any
you
other
record this, Amy, in case we need to go over it again?
It is recorded.
Okay,
Absolutely.
yay. Okay.
I was like, I
It's a
don't remember
lot of
if I heard it.
information.
It's a lot of information to retain, and it's good the first few times you fill it out to like kind of go through it with the recording and make sure you dot all those I's and cross all those T's. Absolutely.
Okay.
Any other
So,
questions?
Amy-
Yeah.
Yep, I do.
Yeah.
So if we have one that's a multi-unit, are we doing it as a residential if it's under 5? It's up to 4, right?
Yeah, residential's up to 4 units.
Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha. You're the best.
And just so you know, on those residential up to 4, that AVID, that agent visual inspection that it talks about, you have to do a separate one for each unit. You can't combine them all into the multiple units. So duplex, triplex, quadplex, you're going to end up with that many AVIDs on that property as well.
You just had to ruin it, didn't you?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Hey, that's our favorite form.
That's our favorite form. Any other questions, thoughts?
Did
No
you
one's
respond to Derek's question about like somebody walking into a new build? That's different, right? Like new builds are new builds,
Oh,
whether
maybe I
they
did.
sign your thing.
Oh, yeah. So if you note other and include new communities, even if you, Derek, if you're still, is Derek still on? He is still on. Derek, even if you don't include new communities on that section of the thing, anytime the buyer buys a property, you would be due the compensation. So whether you put it here or not, you would be due the compensation for a new home community. Now, that doesn't mean that you would be compensated by the new home community, but you could hold the buyer responsible for paying a portion of, for paying that commission. Okay, now I would put it here, I would clarify it, I would put it on the other to include new home communities, off-market properties, and for sale by owners, just so there's never any questions with your buyers, that you communicated to them that you can help represent them in those instances. And it's also a good time when we're going through this to mention like new home communities. Please make sure if you'd like to go see any new homes that you schedule that through me so that I can be there at that appointment so that I can fully represent you in that part, in that process. Right? You could even, if they're like, oh yeah, you get compensated by the seller, right? If you talk to them about that part, you could circle back to new home communities and just be like, new home communities, we also get compensated to represent you from the new home community in most time in most part. However, if you ever go and view one without me, then that's a time that that new home community would not compensate me for the representation period. So it's important that you involve me in that process, right? It's a good way to reiterate that process because some people just don't quite understand that.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying here. So if I have a buyer that goes to a new home community and they are shown a property by the person, you know, the agent that the new home community is, you know, showing all the houses for them. If I'm not physically present at that showing, then if it gets into contract, they don't have to pay me my commission?
The new home community does not have to pay you the commission. For the most part, most new home communities have a policy in place because you don't actually represent the buyer in the transaction. It's a referral fee they pay to agents, right? There's a little caveat there. So the new home community does not have an obligation. They usually have policies in place that if you don't show up with the buyers on their first appointment there when they register, that you aren't due a commission from that new home community. If you have the BRBC in place, then you could hold the buyer responsible for paying the portion of commission when they close on a new home.
I did not know that. That is very good information to have.
Yeah.
And sometimes the new build communities, like they'll say that you can, even if you've called them and you've submitted an email, like if you're not going to be able to go there the first time, like that's just their word saying like, oh, send the email, but that could also not hold up also. So
Yeah,
make sure you go with them.
Yeah, it usually does. If they say, hey, send me an email and or pre-register or we'll hold you, then you know, oftentimes I'll swing by that office ahead of time and fill out the registration form and staple my card to it. or send them fill out the registration form online that then sends an email to the buyers that they confirm you're their agent. So there's a couple different ways that some new home communities do it. Generally speaking, most of them, except for one that I can think of, are usually pretty honorable in what they say. There's one that definitely is not, that will remain nameless. They're not doing much business in this area right now. So for the most part, if you call ahead of time and they go, oh yeah, you can pre-register your clients or set the appointment, I understand you can't be here, we'll count it. Most of the time they hold to that.
Yeah, and if you go out to the homes where maybe you're returning to that place and establish a relationship, I feel like you have a better chance when you call.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think it totally depends on the agent, because like there was an agent that I was working with there, and she's at another place now, and she was totally cool. And then she's not there anymore. I spoke to another person, and then they were like, well, yeah, no. At first they told my buyer, go ahead and send the email. And then they told me that I could. And then they got the manager on the line and they're like, wait, hold on. It may not count. So
yeah. And if you ever have those conversations and they say send an email, you may want to be like, per our phone conversation on this date at this time, I informed you that I may not be able to make it to the first appointment with my clients. Here's their names and numbers. You told me if I send over my information with their information that you would count it as a pre-registration. So here's that information. So you may want to summarize who the phone call was with and what that phone call entailed. But for the most part, you want to show up to those new home communities with your buyer. Just make that your general practice.
and check in, because sometimes they say like that it's only up to 30 days. So if they decide to, even if you registered them and went on the first time and then 30 days passed and they didn't purchase and then they went back, like there's a certain community that's only 30 days here in Vacaville.
Yeah. Yeah. So just let them know that anytime they go to a new home community, you need to be with them. That you're happy to accompany them.
That's some shady stuff, man. That it might be legal in the state of California, but that is shady all day long.
Yeah, 30 days is nothing. I was like, what? I already went with them. And they're like, yep, again.
The whole thing is shady. Even if you don't show up to the showing and then they'd say they don't have to pay you even though you did all the work. I mean, how can that even be legal? You did all of the work, but they aren't obligated to pay you. That is
because again, on new home communities, you're not submitting an offer on a car form. You're submitting an offer, generally speaking, through the builder's representative in the office on their forms and documents. And so they're actually just listing you as a referring agent. So most new home communities are paying you a referral fee for referring an agent to them, not paying you a commission for representing the buyer. So that's how that works with new home communities. Not saying that it's good or amazing, but that's how it works.
I'm going to ask an awful question that some people might be thinking, but, didn't want to say it out loud, but I'm willing to. If your buyers, don't listen to you and they go to a new home community and you didn't know, you didn't go, and then that new home community is like, we don't have to pay you because you weren't there. I mean, do you ever tell the buyer, I can't represent you in this transaction because the new home community, will not allow it or whatever else? I mean, just to bow out gracefully so that you don't have to do a month worth of work and then not get paid for it anyway?
Yeah, well, they're one with new homes. It doesn't take that much work anyways. But number two, absolutely. If they went without you and you didn't have a BRBC signed ahead of time, then I would absolutely be like, just so you know, if you decide to make the purchase in that community, I won't be able to, the builder will not allow me to represent you in that purchase. Or
Okay.
if you got a BRBC sign, you can let them know, and they, if they entered into contract on a new home community, you can submit this to the builder or get the information for the title company and submit it over and hold your buyers to paying you the commission.
Yeah, I'm referring more towards the Zillow buyers that just are not usually willing to sign any buyer broker agreements. They're kind of fidgety about that kind of stuff. So a lot of times you're showing properties without that agreement signed. So
Well, again, even with those Zillow buyers, I would only sign, I would only show 1 or 2 properties before asking them to sign a representation agreement. And I would just outline it as this is what allows me to represent you in the purchase of your home. Without this signed, I can't do that, right? And just make it non-negotiable. In 90% of the other states in the United States, signing this is a non-negotiable item. It's something that just happens. And in California, for whatever reason, it has become optional. And this is your livelihood. This is how you make your money, and this is how you protect it. I would make it a non-negotiable as part of my business.
I am totally good with that.
And again, with those Zillow buyers or online, you may need to go show them a couple properties first and build that rapport and that relationship with them to be able to have that conversation. Yeah. Lisa, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to let you know that my pool guy's here to show me how the pump works, so I have to go.
You do have to go because you don't want a green pool.
No, and it's a brand new pool, so I got to make sure it all works. Now I got to work to pay for it, but I just wanted to say I appreciate your time and thank you so much.
You're welcome. Enjoy your day.
All right, honey, have a good day.
You too. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts? I'm going to schedule a time. I'm going to mark templates down. And I will do another templates training.
That would be great.
Absolutely. Okay, fabulous. Well, it is 12:41, so I'm going to hop off for today. I appreciate the large turnout today. Abby just put in the chat box to log your attendance. So if you haven't done that yet, click on that link, log your attendance. It also gives you the option to suggest additional classes. You may want to put templates in there just so I don't lose my sticky and forget about it. I'm sure I won't, but you may want to throw it in there. But if you have any other suggestions of classes or other forms that you'd like me to cover, like throw it in there under the suggestions and we'll get it on the calendar. I like covering forms. I think it's fun. No. Carly's like, how's that fun, Amy? She's laughing at me.
Only
All right.
only when you're doing it, because other times it's so monotone, I'm like drowning out. But you do it well.
Good. Good. All right. Well, everyone have a fabulous day and feel free to reach out if you guys need anything.